Okay. Well, I'm going to kind of do things a little bit backwards if you're like a chronological, type of person. So to start off with some of the now stuff and then go to the then, if you would. Uh, and on the left there, my side is the newest bird was anyway, or still is for a while, the newest bird added to the list of birds of Ohio. Some folks don't live real far from me, an Amish family just over in Meigs County, right off of Route 32 this winter, looked out. They're big birders. A lot of the Amish are serious birders, really serious. And Mo, who's kind of the head of the construction crew that built a pole barn for me a couple of years ago, said, that's a bird that doesn't belong here. And sure enough, hundreds of people went out to see that bird there. That's called a leisurely bunting, which ought to be well west of the Mississippi River, about as close as they would get to here would be maybe western Nebraska. First record ever of one being seen in the state of Ohio, so that puts it on the official list. And again, maybe some folks here went out there to see it. People were come from all over everywhere, from Cleveland, Toledo, Cincinnati, you name it, to see it. And then we got an Audubon thing of the passenger pigeons, okay, which is definitely a then, not a now. Okay, so we'll move on here. Okay, first, there is an official Ohio bird checklist. As of March 2025, it had, 452 species, the 452nd being that bunting we saw in the previous slide. But just this morning, looking at stuff, I saw a message, because I know birders all over Ohio and stuff, and I'm a member of the Ornithological Society. A Virginia's warbler was spotted up at the lake, and that'll be the first Virginia's warbler, which is even a little farther west than the leisurely bunting. Close, eastern Colorado might be as close as they get to here, and if that record is accepted, that'll be the next new bird. So you make something like a PowerPoint that it's already out of date, perhaps. We'll see. So, but presently it's 452, and that includes all the birds that have ever been reliably recorded as being within the boundaries of the state of Ohio, at least once, okay? And that includes birds that are officially extinct. And one was kind of a surprise when I started doing, I knew it was on the list, but I never knew why until I started preparing for this talk. And birds that are considered extirpated. So there's a couple fancy words. I think everybody knows what extinct means. It means you're not around anymore, then you'll never be around again. And I would advise folks who are thinking about, well, what about this de-extinction thing I'm hearing about with, dire wolves or mammoths or whatever. The only thing I'm going to say about this, I'm not going to say any more except to say, don't ask me unless you enjoy seeing geysers erupt. Okay, that's because I'm not a believer that that's even a faint possibility of happening. So we'll go on from there. But the word extirpated, people are maybe less familiar with, and that means that a bird is no longer in this particular vicinity, in this case the state of Ohio, but it still exists in other places. So there are birds that are no longer in Ohio, but they're out there, and the good thing about it is they might come back again, may be able to return at some point. In fact, a few have, and we'll get to that later on. There's also a phrase called extinct in the wild, which, for instance, the passenger pigeon was for a little while, since the last one. I'm not want to get too far ahead of myself, but the last one died in captivity, actually. So they were extinct in the wild, but still existed for a little while anyway. Okay, but when I said I wanted to start off with the now, I wanted to just kind of quickly say that if you want to know about birds, you're living in the best time possible for learning information about birds. There's an amazing amount of both public and private research, studies, stuff done to learn about birds. One of the neatest books out there is this second breeding bird atlas of the state of Ohio. The first one was done in the 1980s. This one was 2006 to 2011, and it contains up to the time that the book was published. And of course, it's just about out of date the way things change. But there'll be another one coming, not soon. They try to do about every 20 years. Great resource. It's got northern parulas on the cover there, which are a bird that really increased in Ohio. And then the breeding bird survey, and I actually have a route that starts in Jackson County and ends in Ogden County, goes right up through the middle of Vinton County, where once a year you go out and try to record all the birds you can see or hear that are within the nesting season. Then beyond that, which I didn't even put on there or talk about, are things like Christmas bird counts and bird clubs all over the place. And we're just kind of reached the end of the biggest week in American birding. And if you've been up by the lake, McGee Marsh, those kind of places, bumper to bumper traffic, thousands of people with license plates from all over, North America, actually, coming there to see birds. It's pretty doggone hard for any bird to appear in Ohio that is rare and somebody not to see it, to know about it and report it. Like even my buddy Bo, Troyer, the Amish guy, they all got cell phones. They need them for their businesses, so they all got cell phones. So you could bet he, got the word out about this rare bird that showed up at their place. So a major event there. And then other amazing online resources like the Cornell Lab, that they have this Birds of the World thing that anything you wanted to know about any species in the world, you can spend all day just reading about one species. It's amazing the information they have. And the equipment we got today. I mean, you can spend thousands of dollars on high-end pairs of binoculars. We'll be talking about the first folks tried to look at birds in this area and what they had to work with. No comparison, the word. And even stuff like this, think what that thing cost, and he's there, photographing birds. And it's just astonishing the resources that we have available to learn about birds today compared to in the past. So let's look at a famous ornithologist from the past and his tool. I'm going to call his necessary utensil because, yes, it is true. This is Alexander Wilson. And Alexander Wilson, as did John James Audubon or any other famous bird illustrator, since there were no cameras, anything like that, they shot every bird that they painted. It was the only way to get them close enough to have them in the hand, and people kind of, rightfully would frown on going out and doing that today unless it's a game species. But really, there wasn't, what other choice was there at that time if there's a bird up there at the top of this 140-foot tree and you want to get a closer look at it, what are you going to do? So the shotgun was the most important field tool that these guys had, or gals. And that's Wilson's warbler there. This is, my head there. This is a bird I banded during the migration at my place a couple years ago. But not much longer to be a Wilson's warbler because recently the Ornithological Council folks, research folks, have decided that all birds that are named for people, that have people's names attached to them, those are all going to go away. They're going to be renamed because, well, let's face it, all those birds, the vast majority of them are named for dead white guys, long dead white guys, and so at least throughout North America, this is going to happen for all the bird common names. Scientific names are too much. That'd be a total nightmare trying to change them. So those scientific names won't change, but there will at some point no longer be a Wilson's warbler, and there are committees trying to decide what name it will get next. Okay. And so, yeah, we want to change names of some birds because of their name for people. I kind of feel bad about this gal, uh, uh, Anna, who has a hummingbird named for her that we don't even know her last name unless you're a real history buff, and I don't know it. But it's called Anna's hummingbird because some early ornithologist, found this bird and was kind of sweet on her and thought if he named a bird after her that he would, have some success. As it turned out, she still blew him off, and but her first name persists, and I don't know if they're going to change those first name birds or not, but there may not be an Anna's hummingbird any longer either at some point. But those aren't the only dumb names, and this shows you kind of what people knew back then, if you would. Here's a bird called Nashville warbler. I'll catch a few of these and band them every year, spring and fall. And if we look at the map here, I guess the laser pointer won't work on the screen there, but this, kind of whatever color you want to call that up there, the reddish, round whatever, that's where they nest. And the blue is where they are in the winter. In the meantime, they go in between. So some ornithologist in late 1700s, early 1800s, sometime was in Nashville, shot this bird out of a tree, said, we don't know what this is, so we got to name it. Name it Nashville warbler. A bird that neither nests there nor overwinters there. And there is hardly the only one like that. There's bunches of them. There's a Tennessee warbler, Cape May warbler, palm warbler, you name it. I would always tell my students when I taught at Hawken Tech, I was in Nashville and the only warbler I saw was George Jones. So it would make sense to change those names too, but I don't think that's going to happen. Anyway, but it is a real cool little bird, and the Virginia's warbler, which just as maybe been seen up the lake, looks remarkably like them. So maybe it's a mistake, or maybe it's not. And actually, thinking about it, if I was the first person, if this had been an Ohio Ornithological Society grouping, and I came in and got up, and the first thing I said was, oh, somebody saw this Virginia's warbler up at the lake, there have been people heading out the door to get in their vehicle to drive up there because that bird listing thing, to see a bird they haven't seen in the state of Ohio is like a huge deal. And they'd just been, I'd lost half the audience that had been the Ornithological Society meeting. Okay, so I thought I should say a few words about, I'm going to go back to, when people like Alexander Wilson and Audubon, who did spend some time in what is now Ohio, and other ornithologists, the stuff that they would have seen, say, late 1700s, early 1800s. There are birds that are here now that they could not have seen because they weren't there yet, and that's mostly because of us. Like over on the far left, our buddy the European starling, a bird that was deliberately brought here. Part of the idea was, to North America, part of the idea was any bird that got mentioned in any of Shakespeare's plays, people thought I'll be flying around places like Central Park or whatever. So the first European starling ever recorded in Ohio was up about like Coshocton in 1916. But by this time, of course, they are everywhere, and in other countries in the world too. If you go over to the upper right there, a house sparrow, real common bird here in Athens, they started being released deliberately in Ohio, in Cincinnati, Cleveland, other places in the 1860s. And even in Marietta, they let house sparrows loose in 1870. So, and they've been here ever since, although they have been declining with the decline of, horse-drawn transportation, kind of thing, where they were really, really abundant in cities where, every delivery person or whatever was, using horses. And then down in the bottom, the ringneck pheasant, deliberately brought in as a game species in 1896, the first year that they were released in Ohio, and are still out there, in the counties to our west and north somewhat. then the other two have really interesting stories as well. The Eurasian collared dove right here actually got to where we are now under its own power, but real common across Europe and Asia. Somebody, for some reason, I suspect maybe it was so they could hunt them, introduced them to the Bahamas. It didn't take long for them to fly across, and get into Florida, and they're still much more common in Florida than here, but they're part of Ohio's, avifauna now. The first records of them were two that were shot by a hunter, actually, probably thinking they were mourning doves, which are a game species in Crawford County, in 2001. So as a bird that only appeared in our Ohio, bird list or avifauna within this century. At last, the house finch, which has a real interesting history. There was a pet store guy on Long Island, New York, who had house finches in a cage, and the guy walked in and said, and I should say the scientific name of house finches, Carpodocus mexicanus. Give you an idea of their origin. The southwest part of the U.S., they're common, but nowhere east of the Mississippi. But they've got kind of an interesting song, as you know, if you have them around your place. And they decided they were going to sell them as songbirds, cage birds. But somebody walked in and said, "That's a native species in North America. You're in violation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1916, signed by the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And no native bird, without special permits are you allowed to keep, let alone sell." And the guy said, "Oh, I don't want to get in trouble." And he went to the back door and released everyone he had. And you can find maps. I didn't run across one, or I would maybe stuck it in there, of these concentric rings showing the years and how they spread from Long Island. The first one wasn't seen in Ohio until, that was 1940 when we released them all. 1964, house finches appeared in Cleveland. It wasn't until 1972 that the first house finch was seen in Marietta. So yeah, not much more than 50 years ago, did they get here. My daughter lives in Tallahassee, and there are still birders that come from the southern part of Florida up to Tallahassee so they can add house finch to their Florida bird list, because they haven't, gotten much farther south than that yet. Okay, well, enough for that, and we'll go on to sort of back then. Okay, and then we'll go back even farther for a little bit. So the Ohio country, and if you see that up there, it says, hopefully you'll see it from the back there, but it says original vegetation of Ohio, okay? But then in finer print, it says at the time of the first land surveys. And then these are all the different surveys that took place. So here we are, as lots of you know, in the Ohio Company Purchase area. I grew up in the Virginia Military District area there, which had a completely different survey than the rest, and was a total nightmare for surveyors, over there, or for people marking boundaries. So those surveyors weren't out there just making lines on a map. They were also using things like trees what we call witness trees, to indicate where the corner of a property was. They'd say, the point of this is, X number of feet in this compass bearing from this, red oak or whatever. Then they named the species, and also would take a lot of notes between, the points that they were marking, and record a wealth of information about, what things were like, what things were growing and not. And that's how we know what we know, and that has a huge thing for us, because birds, are tied to different habitats. So where could birds have been? We look at this map, we have somewhat of an idea where different species might have been or not been. The yellow in there, again, over on the kind of western side and northwestern part of Ohio, the yellow are prairies, or grasslands or savannas. which there were a few in southeast Ohio as well, but not large enough to be on a map of the scale. But like Buffalo Beach here in Athens County, that some of you may have heard of. Okay, little pocket prairie they call them, and so that's how we know kind of what things were like then at the time that these first, ornithologists and pioneers and stuff Europeans were arriving in North America. And we have a few sort of remnants, if you would, of those places left today. Like on the left there, Dysart Woods, that used to be owned by Ohio University up in Belmont County, and these huge trees that are in there, oaks and tulip trees mostly. And then the Darby Plains up west of Columbus. The best preserved, prairie segments of it are actually in old cemeteries that never got plowed or whatever. And so that's actually one of my former students, A.L. Gibson. Andrew Gibson was one of my students at Hocking Tech, and now one of the best field botanists in the state of Ohio. Okay, so.
What was the large pink habitat on the east of that map?
That was a different type of, I should be able to go back here. Yeah, I couldn't make take a pretty big screen to be able to read that, but all that pink over there is what is called mixed oak forests. Okay, the map there. So there's a fair amount of that, that's pinkish, and then there's a kind of more of an orangish tint there, to my eyes anyway, which is what we call beech, sugar maple, beech, sugar maple type of forest.
The green part?
Okay, all right. Well, the dark green is beech forest. Okay, and that again, that's based on those records. By the way, this is being redone now. There's a team of folks working on doing this, going back to all those old survey records, and they started over in the west side of Ohio, but I've seen some of their work where trying to totally remap this along with some other newer information that's been found to try to generate a better, maybe more detailed map. And I think they're about as far eastward as like Madison County, where London is, if you're familiar with that area. Is about where they've gotten to by now. It'll be a while till they get down where we're at. Okay, now a little segue here. I was at a botanical thing. They used to have these different speakers be brought in by the botany graduate students or plant bio graduate students at OU, and I would come down if I didn't have a class on that afternoon come down from Nelsonville to attend them. And there somebody was talking about Dysart Woods and talking about how they'd cord, meaning use I think on an increment board and determine the ages of these different trees, and the oldest ones in there are 500 and something years old. Okay, and I happened to ask because I was curious. They said, no, this forest, these oldest trees are 500 years old. And I stuck up my hand and said, what was that area like before then? And I'm not going to name the person it was, because, he just wanted to like move on to something else. And he said, it was always like that. Oh. And I replied, being a snarky kind of guy as I sometimes can be, it's too warm for me to wear my curmudgeon as a lifestyle sweatshirt today. But anyway, I said, always is a long time. And which wasn't well received, so we went on from there. Anyways, I thought, when I'm talking here, what Dysart Woods looks like, as cool as it is, that not that long ago wouldn't not have looked like that. And we know that for several reasons. But first we'll go way back. Need Sherman and Peabody's time machine there to go way back. We'll go way back to what we know of the geology of Ohio. And somebody asked me once, in a class, are there any fossil birds in Ohio? And I said, no. And the reason they're not is the youngest, rocks we have here over on the eastern edge of the state are from the Permian period, which ended like 245 million years ago. And the oldest bird fossil records we have, like Archaeopteryx, are about 160 million years ago, which is a pretty long time ago, but not near as far as old as that. So if anybody ever finds a bird fossil in the state of Ohio anywhere, it's going to totally upset the apple cart of what we think we know about the evolution of birds. I wouldn't hold my breath that that will happen, but nothing's impossible, I guess. So we got no fossil record. So we're going to like jump way forward here and go up to the Pleistocene. Okay, so a couple million years ago, lasted a few million, glaciers came down, from farther to our north and covered big chunks of the state of Ohio. But we're in this region that, to our knowledge anyway, was never had, glacial ice over the top of it. So in this unglaciated area, and these, the last, ice age, if you would, ended somewhere like, 12,000 years ago, ballpark figure. And not soon after that, people were coming into Ohio. Obviously not Europeans, but people coming, across the barren land bridge and filtered into North America. And so what would they have seen, if we want to talk about what was here when the first people got here, I mean, I don't want to privilege the Europeans, let's talk about the folks that came before them and what they might have seen. Well, unfortunately, we don't got much in the way of records in one regard, but we do know that here at the edge of the glaciers there were things like mastodons and mammoths and giant ground sloths and all kind of critters that are no longer with us running around. And the forests that we would have had in this part of what is now Ohio would have been spruce and fir and tamarack and all kind of things that we'd have to travel up to the boreal forest of North America to see today. Now, all the birds we have, they all evolved, were all in existence a long time before that happened. So the kind of birds that would have been, where we are now, or in toward the end of the Pleistocene, the last ice age, would have been things like eiders and loons and harlequin ducks and Bohemian waxwings and all kind of birds, fox sparrows and all kind of birds, some of which migrate through here that we associate with, the boreal forest and the tundra and all those things. That would have been the avifauna of where we are today. And what about those oak, hickory, beech, maple, all those things? All those trees survived far to our south, worked by people like Margaret Davis and E.C. Belew, whose book I brought along, and he would like to see it, about the return of life, after the Ice Age. Those trees were in what we call refugia. They were, clear down, and they didn't all go to the same places, like down in what's now the lower Mississippi Valley. That seems to be where maple trees were at during the height of the, ice ages. And over toward the East Coast, that's where hemlocks were, including places that are now underwater because, at the height of the Ice Age, the ocean levels were like 300 feet lower than they are today. So Florida wouldn't look like anything like it does today because, there was so much more exposed land that a lot of things, including archaeological sites from paleo, native, are now underwater out there. So that's where all those trees survived, and they had to work their way back, to our area. So the forests that we have, the oldest ones we've got and see, the first people coming in here wouldn't have seen forests anything like that. Maybe even only 5,000 years ago, the forests would have looked much different than they do today because there would have been species that hadn't got here yet. I mean, there are people who've done what's called paleontology and mapped those. So a much different landscape. But I tried to jump up a little bit again and see what else could the folks who were here before, us have seen maybe. And so I went rummaging around anything I could find. And one thing I thought about, because I spent a lot of time there, especially my younger days, over in Jackson County, and if you read the stuff, it says Leo petroglyph among the carvings are birds. Well, no bird that we can identify, unfortunately. Kind of a stylized bird there or whatever. It's a fascinating place to visit. It actually has some pretty nice bit of forest around it, nice little nature walk there. So if you've never been there, you got to check it out. Plus that interesting horned, guy up there on the left side. So there's only a few other petroglyphs in Ohio, and none of them really have stuff that we can say, yeah, it's that bird or whatever. So we'll jump up a little bit again, because I went rummaging around through what I could find about the archaeology, and I struck some pay dirt for me. I went to the sites of the Ohio History Center and said, okay, what do they got in the archaeological record? And I read about this place that they call Furt. I don't know how it's pronounced. I don't. Furt, F-E-U-R-T. It's in the Sauter County, and it's hard to read from back there, but it says in the fine print there, approximately AD 1000 to 1650. So before the time of about any Europeans would have got here, and they've discovered all of these remains they recognized as being from birds, but didn't feel confident to identify them, so they called in Dr. Alexander Wetmore, who was eventually the 6th secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and one of the greatest ornithologists in the history of the United States, or the world for that matter. And he identified 31 species from these remains that they had at this site. And among them were some far left, lower left, ivory-billed woodpecker. And I'd seen ivory-billed woodpecker on the state list of birds because, I said they put things on there if they'd ever been reliably recorded within the state. But there's no historic records. Nobody ever said I saw an ivory-billed woodpecker in Ohio. If they did, they were wrong, unless they're from way, way back there. But here it is. He identified these things, and and greater prairie chickens, which I'll come back to, and ravens, and several other things we'll say a little more about. So there he is, a great scientist, really cool guy. I worry about the Smithsonian and other things with what I hear in terms of what the feds want to fund, but that's the last thing I'm going to say about any politics, so let that go. But yeah, one of the great institutions, scientific institutions of the world. So we have a lot to thank Dr. Wetmore for in increasing our knowledge, and the Ohio History Center. Okay, so let's go on to talk about this, because this is how it made the Ohio list, the ivory-billed woodpecker, which you notice I didn't put the word extinct on there, although I'm one of the people that believes that it is. Okay, but it can't officially be declared extinct because there was a reliable record of one seen in the eastern part of Cuba as late as 1987. That's the last record. And the folks who do such things, the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, have a rule that says you have to have no reliable records for 50 years before you will list something as being considered extinct. So that's 1987 is not 50 years ago yet. So it's still probably extinct, and I suspect that it is. I'm one of those folks that would always like to believe something is true, but but I'm also, you got to kind of show me the evidence, and so far nobody's been able to. So they found remnants of ivory-billed woodpeckers in 3 counties, actually in Ohio, 3 different archaeological sites. the one in Sauter County, in Ross County, undoubtedly the Hopewell Culture Park or Mountain City, as we call it when I grew up. I got a home gal here in the audience, knows what we're talking about. Yeah, and then Muskingum County. And unfortunately, I didn't find any evidence that the Ross County ones were carbon dated, but the Muskingum and Sauter findings were. And in Muskingum County, the radiocarbon indicates 12th to 14th centuries there, and as late as the 16th century, so the 1500s in Sauter County, but nothing since. But that's enough. Now you might say, well, how do we know people didn't bring those in from farther away? Well, if they found, probably no like wing elements would have survived. A couple things about birds that I think some of you know is they have hollow bones. They don't deal very well with being covered by tons of sediment. They tend to really, come apart. And one other thing that they don't have, people find along the Hawken River occasionally. I had a student who found one, a tooth of a mastodon. Okay, well, and that's not the only time that's happened. And then we've had ones that have been dug up, and indicated that, prehistoric folks here had, butchered them or worked on them and stuff. You're never going to find most likely a bird like that because they're so small and so delicate. But and things like wing elements, perhaps because they're showing us, or even a skull might have got transported from somewhere else and traded or whatever. But leg bones, so unlikely that we figure if you got leg bones, that's an indication that's from the local area. So that's again how it's on the Ohio list. Yeah, and like I say, unfortunately, we know a lot more about birds and their evolution and their occurrence in the past if they had teeth. But no, not for a long time long time as any bird had teeth. So, there's a paleontologist joke, which is about mammals, which is that mammal evolution is, teeth mating to produce slightly modified, descendant teeth. Because it's amazing the number of things. That's what we know about them. All this evidence from teeth because they last way longer than bone. So maybe I know that joke's not a howler, but if there are any paleontologists here, they might chuckle anyway. Yes. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the passenger pigeon. Okay. And there's whole books written about them, so I'm not going to try to go anywhere near to the detail you could. But everybody agrees that they were the most numerous bird of North America, perhaps the world, and the estimates, range widely, but to the low end estimate is like, well, maybe there are only 3 billion of them, maybe there were 5 billion. We know that they were really, really abundant. They were estimated to have made up more than one out of every 3 birds in North America was thought to be a passenger pigeon. And even until the 1800s, J.M. Wheaton, a very famous ornithologist in Ohio history, actually there's still a club called the Wheaton Bird Club that's been in existence since the 1920s up in Columbus. I think it still exists. And so he was saying in the 1850s it was extremely abundant. There was a huge roost and nesting area over at Buckeye Lake area up until that time right before the Civil War. And the birds were so numerous that market hunters started hunting them, and they said this is the easiest thing you could do. You didn't have to aim. You just held your gun up and went like this, and birds fell out of the sky. And so it doesn't seem possible, but by 1875 they almost completely disappeared, and a large part of that was due to to market hunting. Now, kind of like, if I can editorialize just a little bit, there's a little bit like in a sense, like the drug traffic today. I saw where CNN was interviewing some Sinaloa cartel or something member, and it was like, we're just basically filling, there's a market there and we're supplying it. So I'm not going to totally say it's all those bad market hunters out there killing these birds, because there was a huge market for them, and it was way increased by the change in transportation. Here's the railroads built by 1870, and here's the railroad system by 1890. In only 20 years it just exploded. And so these folks could like pack these birds into barrels and ship them off to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, you name it, to sell them. And there was this huge market for them. So that's what was the major cause, along with the habitat change that was taking place, because they did roost in trees and nest in trees, and something about their biology was they all nested at the same time in these huge flocks and clusters, and each pair laid a single egg, which is not good if you're trying to maintain a population. They say that for the human population to stay stable, each female should be having an average or each of 2.2 children, because there's that 0.2 that to replace the father of that child and the mother, and that 0.2 is for folks who decided not to have children or become priests or nuns or whatever, for whatever reason did not reproduce. So one is not getting it. If there's any pressure at all on the adult population, that's a population that's going to decline really rapidly, and it did. Okay, so first, passenger pigeons were extinct in the wild. The last wild bird actually that we know of was actually shot here in the state of Ohio, down in the Pike-Scioto County line in 1900. There's actually a paper I've read that was in some antiquity journal about that. But when it was gone, there were several places like the Cincinnati Zoo, this is in Chicago, a couple other zoos in different places that had small flocks in captivity, and they hoped, well, we can breed them, and maybe get enough of them like we try to do today with some species like red wolves down in North Carolina. They're captive breeding other species, and be able to return them to the wild, but it never worked. There's a kind of a thought in ecology that you need a certain sort of minimum population in any group of animals for them to, engage in the kind of mating behavior and things. They could just never get these birds to mate and reproduce. And so finally there was one left, Martha, named for Martha Washington. And she died at the Cincinnati Zoo, and this is her when she was still alive in 1914. Aldo Leopold wrote a great little essay. Everything he wrote was great to my estimation. But the last line of his sort of eulogy for the passenger pigeon was that they live forever by not living at all.
What was the market for, the feathers or the food?
Food. People are eating them, yeah, big time.
They didn't rot in the barrels before they got to cities?
Well, they packed them with ice.
Oh.
Yeah, that was a huge industry at one time, cut ice and stored it in sawdust and stuff and shipped it that way. The other thing that helped the railroad explosion was it was like 1869 is when George Westinghouse invented the air brake system that, for trains that made them, so much safer, more efficient, longer, all those things. And that's right at the time that the whole railroad system exploded. Yes?
Why were they called the passenger pigeon?
Well, for one thing, I think that they were used sometimes, like people have used other doves, to transport, messages or whatever. That's the thought. But I don't know that that's the fact, but that's always been their name. Okay, so they're gone, and not to return. Although people again sometimes claim they're going to de-extinct them by taking mourning doves and doing manipulating, because we do have genetic stuff from them out there. Okay, we'll talk about another one that is extinct that occurred in Ohio, although not as widespread. It's our only parrot that occurred in eastern North America. There are a couple of, if you go to the southwest, right down to the Mexico border, there are a couple of parrot species that just do get into the United States. But this is the only one in the east here, and mostly their range occurred from the Ohio River Valley up to throughout the Midwest and down to the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so, but we don't actually have any evidence of them nested in Ohio, and some of that could be the fact that they are sort of susceptible to cold weather, so that they didn't spread much farther north than here. And their occurrence in southeast Ohio is pretty sparsely reported, but there was a flock reported in the late 1800s at the mouth of the Little Hawken River, so not far from here, and perhaps some over in the Marietta area. But for the most part, they're kind of within Ohio, but to our south and west. And again, they were already declining in the early 1800s as more of the country was being settled, because they were largely frugivorous when they could. They loved, eating fruits, and so imagine you're trying to have a cherry orchard, and these birds are just pouring in there and eating everything they can. We always used to have to put nets over my mom's cherry trees if I wanted to have a cherry pie, which is my favorite, to keep the Baltimore Orioles and other birds from eating them all before we could get a pie. So imagine what a big flock of these, Carolina parakeets could do. So they were heavily persecuted by farmers, but they'd also, again, been tied to the old growth forests, which were rapidly disappearing as well. They like things like hackberry fruit as well, and some of the other fruits that forest trees would have. People kept them as pets, and then they actually, just like some of the things like herons and egrets and things, became victims of the millinery trade. Feathers were used to decorate women's hats and things like that. The last record in Ohio, near Columbus, 1862. The last wild one we had record of was down in Florida, and killed in 1913. Just like the passenger pigeon, there was one that was named Incas, the last one, who died in the Cincinnati Zoo. So the zoo has the, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a proper word for that, kind of a dubious distinction, if you would, but at least they were trying, I guess, that they had the last Carolina parakeet that died in 1918. And more recent work that's been done genetically indicates that there are actually two subspecies with somewhat different ranges. So we would have had the more central, the North American range versus the ones down in Florida. There's Incas, actually, the last one to be alive, and you can see how colorful they were and get an idea why people maybe wanted them to, for the attire, hats or whatever, because they were a spectacular bird, like a lot of the parrots are today. All right, and here's another one that is almost certainly extinct, but is in the Ohio record of birds. Again, not one like the Nashville warbler, not one that ever nested here or ever overwintered here, but did pass through here and recorded. Extremely abundant, so abundant this was also one that was hunted in huge numbers during their migration, and where they went, not not on their breeding grounds, because it's way up there. I've got a map that'll show that, but they would pass through Ohio and be seen. The last North American sighting that people accept, and there's not even that many photographs, was 1987, and the last one that anybody held in their hand, and yeah, this is Eskimo curlew, was in Barbados in 1963. So that's specimen that was ever collected. Since then, nothing. So almost certainly extinct. Once in a while, a lot of these shorebirds are hard to identify. So there have been what turned out to be mistaken identifications. Hopeful. It's easy. I know as a birder, it's real easy to see what you want to see. You know, that doesn't apply just to birds. You see something, you want it to be this, but it's not, you know, kind of thing. So there have been plenty of that. Okay, and like a lot of species, they had a different route, you know, going north and going south, but way down there is where they, you know, in our winter, they were all the way down there in Argentina and the southern part of, you know, Brazil and Uruguay, and then up there in the upper left, you can see that, you know, colored in area, which is where they nest. So real long distance migrant, and occasionally, you know, they've drawn those lines on there that the best guess or whatever. Anyway, actually, lines like that on maps are where the National Wildlife Refuges are largely located, because they tried to put them in places that they knew were on the migration routes of birds like these guys or waterfowl or whatever. It doesn't mean they didn't occur other places, like passing through the Great Lakes and through or over Ohio. Okay, well, I think I went too far. Yep, I did. I wanted to say something about the greater prairie chicken. I don't want to pass that up, because that was one of the ones that kind of surprised me when I saw that record from Suffolk County. We knew that they had been in Ohio, and my kind of hypothesis would have been that, yeah, we had more open country, more prairie, grassland stuff, you know, down in this part of the state, or than what some people have credited. So now imagine if these birds were still around. People spend good bucks to travel to Kansas, Nebraska, you know, to the spring, when these birds are what we call lekking species. The males gather in big clusters and they do these displays. They call booming. They inflate these air sacs here, which are part of, you know, the respiratory system, and make these, you know, booming sounds, and the females come and stand around, and it's actually only the dominant males that do almost all the breeding. But eventually, if you're a male and keep coming around, eventually those older guys are gone, you know. We know, you know, that females prefer the older males. So anyway, eventually they get their turn. So they take part in this display as well. And spectacular. I mean, it's like a real, like, you know, birder, tourist, ecotourism, whatever kind of thing for during the time they're doing that. And if we still had them in Ohio, there would be people going to the places they were to observe that, crawl into a blind well before dawn and wait for it to become light, and here they are out there, and you can watch them, and it's just amazing. So, and they were, when the first Europeans got here, they were up there in those places, you know, again, sort of northwest part and west part of Ohio. Far south is Pickaway, Fayette counties, but soon went into decline, partly because of that same land that the remnant prairies and things that they were using was sought after, especially after we developed drainage systems, because a lot of those were pretty wet at certain times of the year. They started going into decline, very few reports after the 70s. They were gone by the 1900s, but there were still ones in Michigan, and sometimes they would kind of wander down and people would see a few of them, but the last report of them at all was 1937. And it would be such a cool bird to still have here in Ohio. It really would, yeah. I mean, I have traveled a ways to see them, yeah. Okay, we think maybe how they first got here was there was a period called the xerothermic interval or period, where the climate got much drier. We know that from like things like tree ring analysis and pollen deposits in bogs and things. That between about 8,000, 4,000 years ago, what we call the Prairie Peninsula, famous ecologist at Ohio State, Ian Transeau, wrote a lot of stuff about this. And that Prairie Peninsula, meaning the way it went east and right through the central part of Ohio, clear to the Pennsylvania line, vastly increased the type of habitat that birds like regular prairie chickens would be using. Since then, after 4,000 years ago, the climate went the other way, became wetter again, and all that has, pretty much shrunk away, except for little remnants, prairies and savannas that were still there in the 1800s, and where these prairie chickens still were, and now pretty much all lost to agriculture, except for neat things like this is Dahmer Savanna, which is in western Crawford County, and it has all these wonderful prairie wildflowers and and grasses, and also huge hundreds of year old bur oak trees scattered through it. That's what we call a savanna, a thing with scattered trees versus a totally treeless area that we more properly call a prairie. There's still some of those up there in what's called the Sandusky Plains area. Okay, and here this map shows the present location of greater prairie chickens and a slightly different interpretation of where the tall grass prairie extended to, but even this includes all of the western part of Ohio. And there is still a remnant population in southern Illinois that the state kind of has issues with because with managing the prairie chickens, because they can be sort of outcompeted or competed with by ringneck pheasants. And there are a lot of pheasant hunters out there. They've got their organizations and stuff. They keep on releasing pheasants in an area that the state's trying to keep pheasants out of so they can keep their prairie chickens. Sometimes there's conflicts that happen in what we broadly call wildlife management or conservation, but that's when that they're actually violating the law by deliberately releasing pheasants because they want to be able to hunt them. Okay, so put this up here real briefly. This is the present sort of situation of forest in Ohio, but I sort of need a laser pointer because there are a couple of important numbers on there in the text, and one is that whether the forests look much like it does today or was somewhat different. Pre-colonial settlement time, we figure Ohio was 90-something% forest of various kind, and that cover dropped because of deforestation, largely for agriculture, to the low point. The nadir of forest cover in Ohio was like 12% by 1940. So a huge change in forest cover. And then since 1940, it's increased, was increasing till the early 90s, leveled off about 31%. And since then, it's stayed pretty much the same, even maybe possibly slightly declining. And part of the reason that it's not still increasing is, of course, more development, more suburbs, more whatever, so that we're losing the forest cover, but on the other hand, we've lost 95-98% of the wetlands we had. So in that perspective, and the vast majority of the prairie and savanna habitats we had. But that deforestation that took place brought species in. Tom put the barn owl on the whole thing, advertises this. I better see something about barn owls here, which a lot of people are think are great. And they probably were not here or barely here the time the first Europeans showed up because of it being so heavily forested. And they are an open country, grassland species nesting in cavities, which they still will do sometimes. You could find them actually a cavity, but it takes a fair-sized tree to have a cavity big enough for them to get into. That's why they took over being in barns. So they seem to have come into Ohio from farther west in the mid-1800s and were real common by the 1890s and then hit their peak in the 30s and 40s where there were nesting records from 84 of Ohio's 88 counties. I mean, they were everywhere, just really abundant. And then it all changed again. Agriculture changed is the main thing. Because just if you drive through western Ohio now, what do you see? You see corn and soybeans and wheat and farmers all pulled out those fence rows and the kind of places that small mammals that the barn house would feed on, were gone, and the grasslands were gone. The only reliable place to find barn owls now then is up in, like the Wayne County, Sugar Creek, that kind of where you have all these Amish farmers, because they do mixed farming. They got pasture, they got hayfield, they got barns, they got all kind of stuff, and they still have, barn owls. Down here, they've become real scarce. And the other reason, and this is kind of, Tom will back me up on this, another part of the problem is the loss of the old style barns that, because they're not being used by farmers that much anymore, and they're falling down, becoming decrepit. And when people do build things like barns, they build ones like here on the right where there's no way a barn owl could get in it if it wanted to, and no structure for it to put on. I heard Hugh Wilhelm give a talk somewhere, I think up at Hocking Tech about, and I had a barn down on Dutch Ridge, a farm that I had there, that had an opening at the opposite end from the opening to the mow that was there, that farmers would have these openings just big enough for a barn owl to go in and out of, and he talking about how some of the different geometric shapes and stuff that were kind of decorative, but they were also a passageway for barn owls because the farmers wanted them. They were great things to have, because the number of rodents and things that they would be eating. So yeah, those barns are useless to a barn owl, even though I guess we'd call it a barn. And those other guys are disappearing from the landscape still today. So if you got an old barn, keep it good, maintain it if you best you can. Whoop, again, keep on holding it a little bit too long. Okay, now we're gonna move on to a few more birds real quick here. Just pass by the cowbird. This whole story about these guys coming in during the 1800s, brown-headed cowbirds are another one that entered in Ohio in the 1840s, real common by the late 1800s, but now are declining, substantially because of what the change in agriculture again. Now there's a story about cowbirds which is definitely not true, which is that they evolved to follow the bison or buffalo around, and that's why they are nest parasites and don't build their own nests. You'll hear a lot of people say that, but it's not true. I'm not saying they don't put their eggs in other birds' nests, because they do, but there are actually 6 species of cowbirds in the Americas that are in the same genus as our brown-headed cowbird. They're all nest parasites, and the other 5 of them besides these guys don't live in any place where there are any big mammals to be following around. So if Phil Cantino was here, he'd back me up in saying that being a nest parasite is what the biologists call a plesiomorphic trait. That is, it's one you inherited from a common ancestor. They all do it. Every cowbird is a nest parasite. Okay, so yeah, but they are, declining. They've been declining ever since the first breeding bird survey route started. They're actually listed as species of concern in some of the eastern states, although a lot of birders hate them. Then, I'll call these last couple of them here, they came, they flourished, they gone. That's kind of a pun on one of my favorite baseball announcers would always say when some player on the other team struck out, he'd say, "He gone." So they gone, from the landscape. Buick's wren, they were still looking for these at the time of the first Ohio Bird Atlas because they were still in Ohio. And in fact, if you go back to like the 50s or before that, they didn't come into Ohio. The first record was 1879, the last record 1995. But there was a time when they were the wren in southern Ohio. I mean, the wren. They were way more common than Carolina wrens are today. And they're just kind of traded places. So Buick wrens, I don't remember, well, there's the last record, 1995. So today, if you wanted to see one, you've got to go well out of Ohio. That shows, the little map there shows, where they're at now. They really disappeared from Ohio.
And how are they different from the Carolina red?
They are just a little bit smaller, but they occur in a fairly similar habitat. They really like brushy old fields and hedges and stuff. So it's a little mysterious. Nobody can really put a finger on something and say this is why they left, but they did. I mean, they weren't here until this massive, it may be that the sort of stage of reversion from farm fields to, to brushy, was what they really liked, and that's what brought them into Ohio. And then when things went kind of past that point, then they went away. But nobody's really got that good an explanation. Bachman sparrow. Every time I visit my daughter in Tallahassee, I go into the Appalachian forest in the spring, look for these guys because they're really hard to find. They got a really cool song. Again, the first Ohio record in 1890, and then they peaked real early, World War I to the 20s. If you go to the OU specimen collection, the birds in their collection down in the basement of Irvine Hall, they have a specimen there that was collected from the Waterloo Wildlife Area in 1947. So they were still here, again, that's 70 years ago now, but the last one known in Ohio is 78 in Scioto County. And so again, kind of came and went, and this is their present range. You have to go all the way to the like southern part of Kentucky to maybe find one. The gray part is the more reliable part of their range. Well, come on here. There we go. And one of my very favorite birds, which I actually did see in Ohio and saw what they do, the loggerhead shrike, the butcher bird, looked kind of like a mockingbird in a way, similar in size. Again, same story, came into Ohio in the 1800s, loved the kind of agriculture there was with all these fence rows. Barbed wire was a wonderful invention for them. Before that, they were impaling their prey on hawthorns and honey locust trees. They built up like a larder of dead things that they had killed. The males would, and people said, "Oh, they're putting all this stuff on like these things like the barbed wire, fence." As a larder, to come back and eat later. It turns out it's actually a display that the males do to show what a great provider they would be for the females. Look at all the stuff I killed, and really the females just really dig it, I guess, because that's what they do. But so when we had a lot of, livestock, a lot of pasture, hayfield, and fences and stuff, they were really prospered, and then it all went to that corn, soybean, pull out the fence row stuff. And they were already declining by the 30s. By the time of the second atlas, which was 2006, 2011, they found one nesting pair in the state of Ohio. And now there's so much gone that they don't even have, this is not a Audubon Society map, they don't even put Ohio on the map of even possibly being here. But the good thing about birds being extirpated rather than extinct is they could come back. They might come back. And I've been talking about a lot of birds that are gone, and that's kind of a bummer, but there are some birds maybe not as cool in some ways, but that are taking their place. Like, just got this picture yesterday, okay? My buddy Rebecca Wood was out at the Woodcock Nature Preserve and took photos of male and female blue grosbeaks, which didn't make it into Ohio until 1940, but are working their way farther north into Ohio, and used to be you could only find them like Adams County in the beginning, but they've been working their way northward. Pretty cool birds, and so we are getting a few replacements coming from multiple directions. And my last image here, found or being seen in Athens County now. And again, one who returned from like Pennsylvania. I've forgotten the date of the first nesting record, but it was in the early 2000s. They found them nesting on a high wall in a former strip mine in Jefferson County. So they like to nest on cliffs. So common raven's back in Ohio, and they're working their way down the Ohio River Valley, and are getting to be more commonly seen just east of Athens, Guysville, Little Hawken area. I saw, a pair of them out toward my place. I live in Benton County, and here they are. They're coming back. So here's a species that was extirpated before 1900. They were gone from Ohio, and now they're coming back, which is so cool. And just yesterday, Tuesday, I was drinking some beers at the tap room with my buddy Dan here and other folks, and Steve Riley, who's now like an emeritus prof at OU, has property down on the Shade River country there, and he showed me pictures of common mergansers, which never nested in Ohio at all for some while. And they've been working their way down. They got reported up in Columbiana County a few years ago and are established. And I've got a former student in Monroe County, county north of Washington, where Marietta sees them all the time, and they're nesting there. And so, but this could be the first common merganser nesting record ever in Athens, if they are actually nesting there, which is pretty cool information. So that's the last one I got there. So there's some good news here at the end.